Hello. Welcome. I am glad you are here tonight. Before we begin, a small and gentle note. What you are about to hear is a fictional bedtime narrative. It is inspired by themes and stories found in the Bible, specifically the book of Acts. But this is not a word-for-word scripture reading. It is not a sermon. It is not a theological study. It is simply a calm retelling, shaped for rest, shaped for the kind of quiet that comes when the day is done and you have set everything down. Every scene is safe. Every moment is gentle. You do not need to stay alert. You do not need to remember anything. This story will carry itself, and if you drift away somewhere in the middle, that is not only okay, that is the whole point. So, let your blanket settle around you. Let the pillow hold the full weight of your head. You have done enough for today. You have done more than enough. And now, we begin. I want to take you somewhere with me. Somewhere warm, somewhere old. A city on a hill, made of pale stone, where the evening air smells like bread and olive wood and dust after rain. I am already there, walking slowly through narrow streets. And I would like to tell you what I see. I remember the morning it started. Or rather, I remember the morning after the morning it started. Because the real beginning happened on a hillside just outside the city. And I was not there for that part. I only heard about it later, the way you hear about most important things, quietly. From someone whose voice was still shaking. They told me he had gone, the teacher, the one they had followed for 3 years across every dusty road in this country. He had been with them again after everything, after the trial, after the suffering, after the impossible return. And for 40 days he had walked among them, eating, talking, sitting by fires in the cool of the evening, and then, on that hillside, he had gone, lifted gently away, they said, the way morning mist lifts off a still lake, not with violence, not with spectacle, just a slow, quiet rising, and then the clouds received him, and he was simply elsewhere. I did not see it, but I believed them, because when they came back into the city that evening, they did not look like people who had lost someone. They looked like people who had been given a promise. Let your shoulders soften now, just a little, just enough to notice the difference. I found them in an upper room, a large plain space above a house near the old quarter of the city. The walls were thick and cool. There was lamplight. There were perhaps 120 of them gathered there. Men and women, old and young, faces I half recognized from the markets and the synagogues. They were praying, but it was not the kind of prayer that strains and reaches. It was the kind of prayer that settles, the kind that sounds like breathing. They had been told to wait, and so they were waiting, together, in no particular hurry. I sat down near the doorway. The stone floor was smooth beneath me. Someone had placed a cup of water near the wall, and I drank from it slowly. Outside, I could hear the city winding down for the evening. A cartwheel on cobblestone. A child being called in. The long, low note of a dove. Days passed like that. Quiet days, waiting days. I would come to the upper room each morning and find them already there. Sometimes someone would speak. Simon Peter, usually. A broad man with a weathered face and hands that looked like they had pulled nets for 30 years, because they had. He spoke plainly. He spoke about what had happened and what was coming, though none of them knew exactly what that meant. They chose a new member to join their core group, a man named Matthias. The selection was gentle, unhurried, marked by prayer rather than argument, and then they went back to waiting. I liked those days. There was something rare about them. The kind of stillness you feel on a Sunday night when the week has not yet begun, and everything is held in a soft pause. Then the day came. It was the festival of Pentecost, which meant the city was full. Travelers from everywhere, every province, every language, every far-flung corner of the known world. The streets were crowded. The air was warm. I had gone to the upper room as usual, expecting nothing more than another morning of prayer. And then, something changed. I do not know how to describe it except to say that the room filled, not with people, with presence. There was a sound first, a sound like wind, but not wind exactly. It was deeper than wind. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, as if the whole room had taken a breath. And then there was light, small soft flames that rested above each person like candle glow, not burning, not frightening, just warm, like the room had decided to make visible what had always been invisible, the care, the closeness, the love that holds all things. I stood very still near the doorway. They began to speak, not in their usual language, but in languages they had never learned. Aramaic-speaking fishermen suddenly forming words in Persian, in Egyptian, in the dialects of distant islands. And it was not frantic. It was not chaotic. It was like watching a river find new channels, natural, fluid, inevitable. Let your jaw relax now. Let your tongue rest gently behind your teeth. There is nothing you need to say tonight. They poured out of the upper room and into the streets, and the city heard them. That was the remarkable thing. The travelers, the visitors from every nation, they heard their own languages being spoken by these simple Galileans, and they stopped. They gathered. They listened. Some were amazed. Some were confused. A few laughed and said these people must have had too much wine. But Simon Peter stood up. This fisherman, this man who had once been too afraid to admit he knew the teacher, and he spoke to the whole crowd with a voice that was steady and clear and kind. He told them what had happened, not just that morning, but everything. The life of the teacher, the promises made long ago, the reason for this strange and beautiful wind. I stood at the edge of the crowd and watched faces change, not dramatically, softly, the way a sky changes in the minutes before dawn. You cannot point to the exact moment it shifts, but suddenly everything is lighter. By the end of that day, 3,000 people had joined them. 3,000, and the city was never quite the same. I want to tell you about a woman I met during those early days. Her name was Miriam, and she was the wife of a tent maker. Their shop was on a sloping street near the southern gate, a small space with bolts of heavy fabric leaned against the walls and the smell of wax and thread in the air. Her husband had died the previous winter, a fever that came quickly and left quickly and took him with it. And she had been sewing the tents alone ever since. Her hands were rough. Her eyes were tired. She had 2 children, both young enough to still nap in the afternoon. She had not been in the upper room. She had not been on the street during Pentecost. She heard about it the way most people hear about most things, secondhand, over a shared meal, from a neighbor who could not stop talking about it. But something in what she heard made her curious. And so, one evening after the children were asleep, she walked to the house where the believers were gathering. I was sitting outside that house when she arrived. I remember because she paused at the door for a long time, not afraid, just uncertain, the way you pause before stepping into water when you do not yet know if it will be warm. She went in. What she found was this: people eating together. That was all. A simple meal on a long, low table. Bread torn by hand. Lentils in a clay bowl. Someone had brought figs. Someone else had brought wine. They were sharing everything, not because someone had told them to, but because it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. They made room for her. They handed her bread. A woman whose name I never learned poured her a cup of something warm and sat beside her and asked about her children. Let your hands go loose now. If they are curled, let them uncurl. Let your fingers rest open, like you are holding nothing at all. Miriam came back the next night, and the night after that. She brought her children. Someone watched them while she ate. Someone else brought fabric to her shop the following week, not as charity, but as partnership. They needed tents for a journey north, and they paid her fairly. And when she tried to give the money back, they laughed and said the tents were worth every coin. Over the weeks that followed, I watched her face change. The tiredness did not leave. She was still a widow, still sewing alone, still waking before dawn. But something underneath the tiredness shifted. She was not carrying everything by herself anymore. The early believers called it fellowship, koinonia, in their language. But really, it was simpler than any word. It was just people noticing each other, making room, passing the bread. I think about Miriam sometimes on nights like this. I think about how the most important things often happen not in great rushing winds, but in small ordinary rooms where someone tears a loaf of bread and hands you half. The days that followed Pentecost settled into a rhythm, and it was a good rhythm, the kind that makes you feel like the world is working the way it was always meant to work. The believers met daily. They gathered in the temple courts in the morning, where the stone columns cast long blue shadows and the air was still cool. They prayed. They listened to the apostles teach. And in the evenings they met in homes, different homes, rotating through the neighborhoods. And they broke bread together and told stories and sang. There was a generosity among them that I had never seen before. People who had land sold it and brought the money to be shared. People who had extra gave to people who had little. No one was forced. No one was shamed. It just happened, the way flowers happen in a field that has finally been given rain, and the city watched. Some people joined them. Some people kept their distance. But almost everyone agreed that something unusual was unfolding. Let your eyelids rest now, if they have not already. You can keep them closed. The story will still be here. It does not need your eyes. One afternoon, I remember it was warm, the kind of warmth that makes the stones glow. Peter and John walked to the temple for the afternoon prayer. I followed a few steps behind, not because I was trying to be unseen, but because I liked walking slowly, and they walked with purpose. At the gate called Beautiful, a tall gate, carved and ancient, one of the main entrances to the temple courts, there was a man sitting on the ground. He had been lame since birth. Every day someone carried him to this gate, and he sat and asked for coins from the people passing in. His voice had the practiced tone of someone who had said the same thing 10,000 times. He looked up at Peter and John and asked for money. Peter stopped. He looked at the man directly, not past him, not through him, at him. "I don't have silver or gold," Peter said. His voice was quiet but certain. "But what I do have, I give to you." And then he reached down and took the man's hand and helped him stand. And the man stood. For the first time in his life, he stood. His ankles, which had never held weight, held weight. His legs, which had never walked, walked. And then, and this is the part I remember most clearly, he did not walk. He leaped. He jumped like a child who has just discovered what jumping is. He went into the temple courts, laughing and leaping and praising, and everyone who saw him recognized him as the man from the gate. and they did not know what to make of it. Peter, as was his way, spoke to the crowd that gathered. He was always careful to say that this was not his own power, not his own holiness. He pointed away from himself, always, toward the teacher, toward the one who had gone, and yet remained somehow present in everything. The temple leaders were not pleased. They brought Peter and John in the next day, questioned them, warned them, told them to stop speaking about these things. Peter and John listened politely, and then they went right back out and kept going. I admired that, not because it was bold, though it was, but because it was steady. They were not looking for confrontation. They were not trying to provoke anyone. They simply could not stop talking about what they had seen, the way you cannot stop talking about a sunrise that took your breath away, or a kindness that changed the shape of your whole day. The evenings in Jerusalem during those early days had a quality I have never quite found anywhere else. The sun would lower itself behind the western hills, and the stone walls would turn the color of honey, and then the color of copper, and then the color of ash, and then the stars would come. I would walk the streets slowly, past the bakeries where the ovens were cooling, past the courtyards where families were settling in for the night, past the wells where the last water jars were being filled. The city made its nighttime sounds, a door closing gently, a prayer murmured through a window, a dog turning in circles before lying down. Sometimes I would pass by one of the homes where the believers were meeting, and I would hear them singing. Their songs were simple, old psalms mostly, set to melodies that swayed like lamplight. The sound would drift out through the windows and mix with the evening air, and I would stand still and listen, and something in my chest would loosen. Take a slow breath now. Let it out like a long sigh. There's no right way to do this. Just let the air leave you gently. The early church was not perfect. It was not a story without complications. But in those first days, there was a sweetness to it, a newness, a tenderness that felt like the first week of spring, when everything is just beginning and the air itself seems hopeful. I will tell you more. There is so much more to tell about the roads they would travel, about the storms they would walk through, about the strangers they would meet who would become family. But for now, let the city settle. Let the lamps dim. Let the singers finish their song. You are resting now. You are held. The story will keep, and when you are ready, we will walk a little further together. The stars over Jerusalem are very bright tonight. I can see them from the rooftop where I am sitting. The air is cool and still. Somewhere below me, a mother is singing her child to sleep in a language I almost understand. The stones are warm beneath me, still holding the heat of the day. Everything is quiet. Everything is well. I stayed in Jerusalem through the turning of the season. The days shortened by small degrees. The mornings carried a faint chill that had not been there before, and the community of believers continued to grow, quietly, steadily, the way a vine grows along a garden wall, not all at once, but every time you looked, it had reached a little further. The apostles taught daily in the temple courts. They stood in Solomon's colonnade, a long covered walkway on the eastern side of the temple, where the columns were old and tall, and the light fell through in pale slanting bands. People gathered there, not just to listen, but to bring their sick, their weary, their worn down, and there was healing. Not loud healing, not theatrical healing, the quiet kind, the kind where someone who had been suffering simply was not suffering anymore. And they sat very still for a moment, almost confused, as if they had forgotten what it felt like to not be in pain. The temple authorities watched all of this with growing unease. They brought the apostles in again. They held them overnight in a common cell. And yet, the next morning the apostles were found back in the temple courts, teaching as if nothing had happened. I was there for the council meeting that followed. I sat in the back of the hall, near a pillar where the shadows were deep, and no one paid me any attention. The leaders were frustrated. Some were angry. They wanted to silence these fishermen and their impossible claims. But one man stood up, an old teacher named Gamaliel, respected by everyone in the room. He was calm. His voice had the unhurried quality of someone who has seen many movements rise and many movements fall. He said simply, "If this is merely a human effort, it will fade on its own, the way all human efforts eventually fade. But if it is something more, then you will not be able to stop it, and you would not want to try." The room was quiet for a long moment after he spoke. I could hear pigeons on the roof. They let the apostles go, not happily, not without warning, but they let them go. And the apostles walked out into the afternoon sun and kept doing exactly what they had been doing. There is a kind of courage that does not look like courage. It does not shout. It does not clench its fists. It simply continues. It wakes up the next morning and does the gentle, necessary thing again. That was the courage I saw in those days. Let your breathing settle into its own pace now. You do not need to guide it. You do not need to count it. Just let it come and go, like small waves on a shore that has no agenda. As the community grew, small fractures appeared, not dramatic ones. Not the kind that break a thing apart, the kind that show up when something is stretching to hold more than it was built to hold. I noticed it first at the evening meals. There was a widow named Helena. She was Greek-speaking, originally from the coast, a quiet woman with silver hair pulled back and hands that moved slowly, deliberately, as if each gesture cost her something. She had come to Jerusalem years ago with her husband, and when he passed, she stayed. She had nowhere else to be. In the early weeks when the community was small, everyone was fed. The meals were intimate. You could see every face across the table. But as the numbers swelled, hundreds, then thousands, the meals became larger, more complicated, harder to manage, and somehow, in the growing crowd, Helena was missed. Not on purpose, never on purpose. She simply sat at the far end of the table, and the bread ran out before it reached her. She did not complain. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the others eat and said nothing. She came back the next evening and the same thing happened, and the evening after that. I saw her leaving one night, walking slowly down the lamplit street, and I walked beside her for a while without speaking. The air was cool. Her sandals made a soft sound on the stone. After a few minutes she said, not to me exactly, but to the night itself, "I do not mind being hungry. I mind being unseen." That sentence stayed with me. It stayed with others too, because Helena was not the only one. Many of the Greek-speaking widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. It was not malice. It was simply the clumsiness that comes with rapid growth. When a family of 20 becomes a family of 2,000, some people fall through the gaps. The apostles heard about it, and rather than dismiss it or delay, they gathered the whole community and said something I found deeply wise. They said, "We cannot do everything. We are stretched thin between teaching and prayer and managing these practical needs, and the practical needs are suffering for it. So let us choose people, good people, wise people, full of kindness and the Spirit, and let them give their whole attention to this." 7 were chosen. I remember their names being called out one by one in the warm air of the courtyard. Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, Nicholas. 7 men who would make sure the tables were fair. 7 men whose ministry was, in its simplest form, making sure no one was unseen. Let your shoulders release again. Sometimes we gather tension back without realizing it. Let it go a second time. Let it go as many times as you need to. The next evening, I watched from my usual spot near the doorway. Helena was sitting in her usual place at the far end of the table. But this time, one of the 7, I believe it was Philip, brought her a plate himself. Bread, lentils, a few olives, a cup of wine. He set it down in front of her gently, the way you set down something precious. She looked up at him. She did not say thank you. She said something smaller and larger than thank you. She said, "You see me." He nodded, and then he moved on to the next person and the next, making his quiet way down the table, making sure every plate was full. It was not a miracle, not the kind that makes crowds gasp, but I think sometimes the most sacred thing a person can do is notice who has been missed and walk toward them with bread in their hands. Helena came back every evening after that. She never sat at the far end again. Someone always saved her a place closer to the center. And sometimes, when the meal was winding down and the lamps were burning low, I would see her tear her own bread in half and pass it to the person beside her. That is how it works, I think. That is how it has always worked. Someone sees you and then you see someone else, and the seeing spreads outward like lamplight through a window. Among the 7 who were chosen to serve the tables, Stephen stood out. Not because he sought attention, he did not, but because there was a quality to him that was hard to look away from. He was young, I think. His face had the kind of openness that comes before life has taught a person to guard themselves. When he spoke, even casually, even about small things, people leaned in. He began to teach. In the synagogues, in the marketplaces, in the courtyards after meals. He spoke about the long arc of their people's story, how it bent and curved and doubled back and always pointed towards something, towards someone. His knowledge was deep, his words were clear, and some people did not want to hear them. I will not dwell on what happened next, because this is a place of rest. And some stories are better held lightly, like a stone you turn over once in your palm and then set gently down. What I will tell you is this. Stephen was brought before the council. He was accused. He was given a chance to speak, and he spoke, not in his own defense, but about the whole sweeping story of faith from the very beginning, from the first promises made under ancient stars, all the way through to the present moment. It was the longest and most complete telling I had ever heard, and when it was over, the crowd was not kind. Stephen was carried through that moment the way a river carries a leaf, not by his own strength, but by something beneath and around him. His face, they said, looked like the face of someone who was already seeing something the rest of them could not. Something vast, something warm, something waiting for him. He passed gently from this world, and the last words on his lips were words of forgiveness. I sat alone that evening on a rooftop and watched the stars and felt the particular kind of sadness that comes not from despair, but from having witnessed something both terrible and holy at the same time. A sadness that sits beside wonder and does not cancel it out. Take a slow breath here. A deep one if you like, or a shallow one, whatever your body wants. There is no wrong way to breathe tonight. After Stephen, things scattered, and I mean that almost literally. A great pressure came down on the believers in Jerusalem. Not a single dramatic event, but a steady tightening, like a hand slowly closing, and the believers, rather than huddle together and wait for it to pass, did something unexpected. They left. They spread out. They went to Judea, to Samaria, to the coastal towns, to the hill country, to places they had never been. And everywhere they went, they carried the story with them. It was like watching someone scatter seeds across a wide, wide field. What had been concentrated in one city was now distributed across the entire landscape. And in every new town, in every new village, small green shoots began to appear. Philip, the same Philip who had brought Helena her plate of bread, went north to Samaria. I followed, a few days behind, walking the road at my own pace. The countryside was beautiful in a sparse, honest way. Brown hills, olive groves, the occasional flock of sheep moving across a slope like a slow white cloud. In Samaria, Philip taught and healed and baptized. The people there received him with a kind of surprised joy, as if they had been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting. I stayed for a few days, sleeping in the courtyard of a family that took in travelers, listening to the night sounds of an unfamiliar town, different insects, different breezes, the same stars. And then Philip was called away, southward, toward a road that ran through empty country, between Jerusalem and Gaza. A desert road, a road where you might walk for an hour and see no one. I will tell you what happened on that road. The road south was dry and pale. The dust rose in small puffs with every step. The sun was high, and I walked with a cloth over my head, the way everyone does on that road in the heat of the afternoon. There was almost no shade, just the occasional scrub brush, low and gray-green, clinging to the rocky soil. I did not expect to find anyone out here. That is what made it feel like a kind of gentle mystery. Why would Philip, who had been doing so well in the crowded towns of Samaria, be called to this empty ribbon of road in the middle of nowhere? And then I heard it, the creak of wheels, the slow clop of hooves, a chariot moving southward in no particular hurry. I stepped to the side of the road and watched it approach. It was a fine chariot, well made, with a small canopy for shade. The man riding in it was from far away. His clothes were rich. His bearing was dignified. I learned later that he was a court official from Ethiopia, a man of significant authority, returning home from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He was reading aloud. That is what I noticed first. He held a scroll open on his lap, and he was reading from it in a low, puzzled voice, the way you read something when you can feel that it means more than you are grasping. The words drifted back to me on the dry air. They were from one of the old prophets, words about someone led like a sheep to the shearer, someone silent before those who would harm him. Beautiful, sorrowful, hopeful words. Philip was already walking alongside the chariot by the time I caught up. He had appeared from somewhere, I did not see from where, and he was keeping pace with the wheels, looking up at the man with an expression of quiet interest. "Do you understand what you are reading?" Philip asked, not challenging, not condescending, just curious, the way you might ask someone if they need help carrying something heavy. The man looked down at him. "How can I," he said, "unless someone explains it to me?" And then he did something that I find deeply moving every time I think of it. He invited Philip up into the chariot. This important man, this high official from a distant court, made room on his bench for a dusty traveler and said, in essence, "Sit with me. Help me understand. I have been reading these words alone, and I cannot find my way through them by myself. Let your eyelids grow heavy now, if they have not already. Let them close like curtains drawn softly at the end of a long, good day. The The story will keep going. It does not need you to watch, only to listen, and even that is optional. Philip sat beside him. The chariot rolled slowly southward. The wheels turned, the dust rose and settled, and Philip began to explain. He started with the passage the man was reading and moved outward from there, the way ripples move outward from a stone dropped in still water. He told him about the teacher, about the life and the love and the promises, about the wind in the upper room, about the bread broken at long tables, about the way everything, every old word, every ancient hope pointed toward this one extraordinary, ordinary person who had walked among them. The Ethiopian man listened. He listened the way you listen when something you have been searching for is finally being placed gently into your hands. They came to a place where water crossed the road, a small spring, or a pool fed by some underground source, unexpected in that dry country, like a gift left beside the path. The water was clear and still. "Look," the man said, "here is water. What would prevent me from being baptized?" And Philip said nothing would prevent him, nothing at all. They stopped the chariot. They climbed down. They walked into the water together, the court official and the dusty traveler, and Philip baptized him there, in that unnamed pool, on that empty road, with no audience but the sky and the scrub brush, and one quiet witness standing at a distance. When they came up out of the water, Philip was gone, simply gone, the way he had simply appeared, called elsewhere, carried to the next place, the next conversation, the next person reading alone and wishing for company. The Ethiopian man stood in the road for a long moment, water still dripping from his clothes, and then he climbed back into his chariot and continued south, toward home, toward Ethiopia, toward whatever waited for him there. And the scroll says, he went on his way rejoicing. I like that detail. He went on his way rejoicing, not because everything was suddenly easy, not because the road home was short. It was very, very long, but because he was no longer reading alone, because the words on the scroll had opened up like a door, and he had walked through, and on the other side was something vast and warm, and his. I stood on the road and watched the chariot grow small in the distance. The dust it raised hung in the air for a long time, golden in the afternoon light, before settling back down to earth. I did not follow the chariot. I stayed on the road as the sun lowered and the air cooled, and the colors of the landscape shifted from gold to amber to a deep, restful blue. I found a place to sit, a flat rock beside the road, still warm from the day's sun. I leaned back. The first stars were appearing, not all at once, but one by one, as if someone were lighting them carefully, taking their time, making sure each one was placed exactly where it needed to be. The night insects began their slow chorus, a sound that rises and falls, like breathing, like the world itself is breathing. I let my own breath match it without trying, in and out, in and out. I thought about the day, about Philip appearing out of nowhere on a quiet road, about the Ethiopian man reading aloud to himself and wishing for understanding, about the unnamed pool of water that happened to be exactly where it was needed. So much of this story, I was learning, happened not in temples or council halls, but on roads, on dusty, ordinary, unremarkable roads, in the space between one city and the next, in the journey itself. Let your whole body settle now. Let the bed hold you completely. You are not on a road tonight. You are somewhere soft and safe and still. But if you were on a road, it would be a quiet one, and the stars would be out, and the air would be exactly the right temperature, and there would be nowhere you needed to be by morning. The rock beneath me was warm, the sky above me was wide, and I rested there on the southern road, listening to the night breathe, feeling very small and very held, both at the same time. And the road stretched on, southward and northward and in every direction, and there were more stories waiting along it. A man named Saul who was about to have the longest, strangest walk of his life, and a woman named Tabitha who was loved by an entire town, and a centurion in a coastal city who was about to receive visitors he never expected. But those stories are ahead of us, and we are in no hurry. Rest here for a moment. The stars are very bright. There was a man I had been watching for some time, not closely, not deliberately, but the way you watch a storm building on the horizon, from a distance, with a quiet awareness that it is moving and that eventually it will arrive. His name was Saul. He was from Tarsus, a city far to the north, a place known for its university and its trade and its sharp, restless thinkers. He had come to Jerusalem years before to study under the finest teachers. He was brilliant. Everyone said so. He could argue a point so precisely that it felt less like a debate and more like watching someone build a house, brick by careful brick, until the structure was airtight and unassailable. He was also deeply, fiercely certain that the believers were wrong. I had seen him at Stephen's trial. He had not thrown anything. He had not shouted. He had simply stood to the side, holding the cloaks of those who did, and watching with an expression that was not anger exactly, but something harder to name. Conviction, maybe. The dangerous kind. The kind that does not question itself. After Stephen, Saul became the primary force pressing against the community. He went house to house. He sought letters of authority from the high priest. He was thorough and relentless, and absolutely sure that what he was doing was right. And that certainty, that unquestioning certainty, was what made him so effective and so frightening. I kept my distance. I watched from the edges of streets. I heard reports from others, and then one day I heard that Saul had obtained letters for Damascus, a city to the northeast, several days' journey through dry and hilly country. There were believers in Damascus, and he intended to find them and bring them back in chains. He left Jerusalem on a morning that was bright and hot. I followed far behind on the same road, not because I was brave, because something in me simply needed to see what would happen next. The road to Damascus is long. It takes you through country that changes gradually, the hills around Jerusalem giving way to flatter land, then rising again as you approach the city from the south. The sky out there is enormous. It stretches from edge to edge of the world without anything to interrupt it. Saul traveled with a small group. I could see them ahead of me sometimes, small figures moving along the pale road, shimmering slightly in the heat. They walked with purpose. They did not stop often, and then, somewhere on the road, somewhere in the open country outside Damascus, where the land is flat and there is no shelter and the sky is as wide as it has ever been, something happened. I was too far behind to see it clearly, but I saw the light, even from a distance, even with the sun already blazing overhead. I saw it. A brightness that made the noon sun look like a candle. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It poured down on the road like water, like white water, and the small figures ahead of me crumpled to the ground. Let your breathing be slow now, slow and easy, like a tide that has all the time in the world. By the time I reached them, the light was gone. Saul's companions were standing, dazed, looking around with the blank faces of people who have heard thunder from a cloudless sky. They had heard a sound, they said. A voice, maybe. They were not sure. They could not make out words, but Saul was on his knees, and his eyes were open, but not seeing. The light had taken his sight, not violently, wuss. There was no wound, no mark, but completely. He knelt in the dust of the road with his hands open at his sides, and he was shaking, not with fear, with something deeper than fear, with the sudden total realization that he had been wrong. He had heard a voice. He told me later, much later, when we had become something like friends. He said the voice was not angry. That was what undid him. He had expected, if this moment ever came, thunder and judgment and wrath. Instead, the voice simply said his name, twice, gently. The way a parent says the name of a child who has been running in the wrong direction. Saul, Saul, why are you working so hard against me? And Saul, for the first time in his life, had no argument, no rebuttal, no carefully constructed counterpoint. He had only a question, and the question was very small. Who are you? And the voice told him. And everything Saul had built, every certainty, every conviction, every brick in that airtight house came down, not in destruction, in release. The way a fist unclenches, the way a held breath finally lets go. His companions led him by the hand into Damascus. He could not see. He did not eat. He did not drink. For 3 days he sat in darkness in a house on a street called Straight, and I imagine, though I do not know, that those 3 days were the longest and the quietest of his entire life, the silence of a man who is being remade from the inside out. There was a believer in Damascus named Ananias. I want to tell you about him because I think his part in this story is one of the bravest things I ever witnessed, and it looked nothing like bravery. Ananias was ordinary. I say that with deep respect. He was a quiet man who lived in a quiet house on a quiet street. He made his living. I believe it was leatherwork, though I may be wrong. And he prayed each morning and each evening, and he was known in the community not for anything dramatic but for being steady, reliable. The kind of person you could leave your house keys with and never worry. He had heard of Saul. Everyone had heard of Saul. The name alone was enough to make the believers in Damascus check their doors at night. Saul was the reason some of them had fled Jerusalem in the first place. He was not a distant threat. He was a specific, approaching, well-documented one. And then, one night, Ananias received a message in his sleep, a clear, unmistakable instruction. Go to the house on Straight Street. Find Saul. Lay your hands on him. Heal his eyes. I know what Ananias felt, because I saw his face the next morning. I was staying in a house nearby, and I passed him in the street as he stood outside his own door, not moving, just standing there with the expression of a man who has been asked to do the one thing he most does not want to do. He was afraid. Of course he was afraid. This was Saul. This was the man who had come to Damascus specifically to arrest people like Ananias. Walking into that house and laying hands on him was like walking into a lion's den and offering to brush its mane. But, and this is the part I want you to hear as you rest tonight, Ananias went. He did not go boldly. He did not go with confidence. He went the way people actually go when they are doing something brave, with trembling hands and a dry mouth, and a prayer that was probably just the same 3 words repeated over and over. Let this be okay. Let this be okay. Let this be okay. Let your hands rest open on the bed beside you. Feel how soft the sheets are beneath your fingers. You are safe here. Nothing is being asked of you tonight. I followed Ananias to the house on Straight Street. I stood outside near a window that was slightly open, and I listened. The house was dim. Saul was sitting in a back room. He had not moved much in 3 days. His face was thin. His eyes were closed, not because he chose to close them, but because open or closed made no difference. He was in darkness either way. Ananias entered the room. I heard his sandals on the stone floor, heard them stop. There was a long pause, long enough for Ananias to take in the sight of this man he had feared for months, now sitting blind and frail and broken open on a low wooden bench. And then Ananias said something that still makes my throat tighten when I think of it. He said, "Brother Saul, brother, not enemy, not persecutor, not the man who imprisoned my friends. Brother." He crossed the room. He placed his hands gently on Saul's face. He told him that the same one who'd appeared on the road had sent Ananias here, to this room, to restore his sight and to welcome him in. And something fell from Saul's eyes. The text says it was like scales, like thin flakes, and he could see again. He looked up at Ananias, and Ananias looked down at him. And for a moment, the two of them just stayed like that. The hunter and the hunted, standing in a dim room on a quiet street, and the word between them was brother. Saul was baptized that day. He ate for the first time in 3 days. And within a week, he was in the synagogues of Damascus, speaking about the very thing he had come to destroy. The believers were shocked. Some did not trust it. You could see it in their faces. The careful distance, the sideways glances. They had built walls against this man, and walls do not come down as quickly as eyes are opened. But Ananias trusted it. Ananias, who had the most reason to doubt, was the first to believe, because he had been in the room. He had felt the tremble in Saul's shoulders when he laid his hands there. He had seen the tears. I think about Ananias on nights when I am afraid. Not afraid of large things necessarily, but of small ones. The knock on the door I do not want to answer. The conversation I do not want to have. The person I have decided is beyond reaching. I think about him standing outside his own house in the morning light, terrified, and going anyway. Going anyway. That is the whole story. That is the whole brave, trembling, beautiful story. Time passed. The story widened. Saul remained in Damascus for a while, then slipped away when the danger grew too great, lowered over the city wall in a basket at night. Of all things, which is the kind of detail that makes you realize this story was never meant to be dignified. It was meant to be real. I made my way westward, toward the coast. I wanted to see the sea. I'd been inland for so long. Dusty roads, stone cities, the endless brown hills, and I craved the sound of water. I came to Joppa, a port city perched on the edge of the Mediterranean. The air there was different, salty, damp. The light had a softness to it that the inland light did not. Everything felt slightly blurred at the edges, as if the whole city were a watercolor painting that had not quite dried. Peter was there. He had been traveling too, moving through the towns and villages of Judea, and his path had brought him to the coast. He was staying in the house of a man named Simon, a tanner, whose home sat right at the edge of the sea. You could hear the waves from the rooftop. I will tell you what happened on that rooftop, because it changed the shape of everything. It was noon. The sun was directly overhead. Peter had gone up to the flat roof of the house to pray, and while he was there, he grew hungry. The meal was being prepared below, and the smell of it drifted up. Bread and herbs, and something roasting slowly. And in that drowsy, hungry, in-between space, Peter had a vision. Let your eyelids rest fully closed now. Let the darkness behind them be soft. It is just darkness. It is the gentle kind. the kind that holds you while you sleep. He saw something like a great sheet being lowered from the sky, a vast cloth held at its four corners, descending slowly, the way a sail descends when the wind stops. And on the sheet were animals, all kinds of animals, animals that, according to every rule Peter had grown up with, he was not supposed to eat. They were unclean by the old laws, forbidden. And a voice said, "Get up, Peter, eat." Peter refused. He had never eaten anything unclean. He had followed the dietary laws his entire life. The refusal was automatic, instinctive, as deep as bone. The voice said, "Do not call unclean what has been made clean." This happened 3 times. 3 times the sheet descended. 3 times the voice spoke. 3 times Peter resisted. And 3 times the resistance was gently, firmly set aside. When the vision faded, Peter sat on the rooftop in the noon sun, blinking, trying to understand. And before he could, there was a knock at the door below. 3 men stood at the gate. They had been sent from Caesarea, a Roman city up the coast, by a centurion named Cornelius. Cornelius was not Jewish. He was Roman, a military officer, a man who by every cultural and religious boundary of the time should have had nothing to do with Peter, and Peter should have had nothing to do with him. But Cornelius had his own vision. An angel, or something like an angel, had told him to send for Peter, and so he did. And so the 3 men stood at the gate. And Peter, still turning the rooftop vision over in his mind, still feeling the weight of that great descending sheet, understood. The vision was not about food. The vision was about people. It was about the walls between clean and unclean, insider and outsider, us and them. It was about those walls coming down, gently, firmly, the way a sheet descends from an open sky. Peter went with the men to Caesarea. I followed along the coastal road, and the sea was on our left the whole way, gray-blue and endless, and the sound of it was steady and rhythmic and deeply, deeply calming. Take a slow breath now, in through your nose if that is comfortable, out through your mouth like a long, soft sigh. You are doing beautifully. You are resting beautifully. When Peter arrived at Cornelius's house, a crowd was waiting. Cornelius had gathered his family, his friends, his household, everyone he cared about. He had been so certain that something important was coming that he wanted everyone he loved to be present for it. Peter walked in and looked around at these Roman faces, these non-Jewish faces, these faces that his entire upbringing had taught him to keep at arm's length. And he said, simply, honestly, "I am learning something. I am learning that God does not have favorites, that this love, this story, this wind that blew through the upper room, it is not for some people. It is for all people, every nation, every language, every face." And while he was still speaking, the wind came again. Right there, in a Roman centurion's living room, the same presence that had filled the upper room at Pentecost filled this room too. And the people there, Roman, Gentile, outside every boundary, began to speak and praise and weep with the same joy the apostles had known on that first morning. Peter's companions were stunned. Their mouths literally fell open. This was not supposed to happen. This was not how the categories worked. But the categories, it turned out, were smaller than the love. They had always been smaller than the love. Cornelius and his household were baptized that day, in a Roman house, by a Jewish fisherman, with the sound of the Mediterranean coming through the windows. The walls were coming down. Before Peter went to Caesarea, something happened in Joppa that I want to tell you about. It is a quieter story, a smaller story, the kind you might tell someone just before they fall asleep, There was a woman in Joppa named Tabitha. In Greek they called her Dorcas. Both names mean gazelle, which I always found fitting because there was something graceful about her, even though she was no longer young, and her back was slightly bent from years of leaning over her work. Her work was sewing. She made garments, tunics and robes mostly, for the widows of the town, not for pay, not for recognition. She simply noticed that the widows were cold in winter and threadbare in summer, and she had a needle and thread and fabric, and so she sewed. I met her once, briefly, in the weeks before Peter arrived. I had stopped at a well near her house to fill my water skin, and she was sitting outside her door with a basket of cloth in her lap, stitching in the late afternoon light. Her fingers moved with the unconscious ease of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become an extension of breathing. I asked her what she was making. She held it up, a simple tunic, dark blue, well constructed. For Miriam, she said. She has only the one, and it is wearing thin at the elbows. That was it. That was the whole exchange. But I noticed the basket beside her, and it was full, a dozen garments in various stages of completion, a dozen acts of quiet, specific love, each one cut and stitched for a particular person with particular needs. Let your body grow heavier now. Feel yourself sinking into the mattress, slowly, like a leaf settling onto still water. No resistance, just a gentle, slow descent. Tabitha fell ill. It came quickly, the way illness sometimes does in warm climates. One day she was sewing, the next day she was in bed, and the day after that she was gone. The town mourned her immediately and deeply, in the particular way a community mourns someone who has been woven into the fabric of daily life. The widows gathered in her upper room. They stood in a circle and held up the garments she had made them. This is the tunic she sewed for me last winter. This is the robe she mended when my only one tore. Look at the stitching. Look at the hem. Every stitch was an act of attention. Every garment was proof that someone had been paying attention to their lives. Someone sent for Peter. He was nearby, in a neighboring town. He came quickly. I was outside the house when he arrived. I could hear the weeping through the walls, not dramatic weeping, but the soft, steady kind that comes from genuine loss. Peter went upstairs. He asked everyone to leave the room. The door closed. The house went quiet. I do not know what happened in that room. No one does, except Peter and the still, small presence that was with him. But after some time, it could have been minutes, it could have been longer, the door opened, and Peter came out, and Tabitha came out behind him. She was alive. She was blinking in the lamplight, looking around at the familiar room as if seeing it for the first time. And the widows, who had been clutching her garments to their chests, now clutched her instead, and the weeping changed. Same tears, different direction, the way a river can reverse in a single moment and flow toward joy. The news spread through Joppa like warmth spreads through a cold room when someone opens the curtains to the sun. And many people believed. Not because of the miracle itself, I think, but because of what the miracle pointed to. A woman whose life had been so full of small, faithful love that even death could not keep the community from wanting her back. I think about Tabitha when I think about what matters. Not the grand gestures, not the speeches before councils, the tunics, the dark blue fabric cut to the right length for a woman named Miriam whose elbows were showing through her only garment. The quiet, daily, unglamorous work of noticing what someone needs and providing it with your own two hands. That is the kind of faith that builds a community strong enough to weep when it loses someone. And that is the kind of community that is worth being part of. Tabitha went back to her sewing the following week. I saw her outside her door again, basket in her lap, fingers moving steadily. She did not seem changed exactly. She seemed more herself, more fully, deeply, permanently herself, as if the interruption had only clarified what had always been true, that her purpose was here, in this chair, with this needle, making sure no one in her town went cold. The afternoon light fell across her hands, the thread caught the sun, and she sewed. That evening I walked down to the water. The beach at Joppa is rocky, not the smooth sand of some coastlines, but a tumbled collection of stones and shells and bits of old wood brought in by the tide. I found a dry place to sit and watch the sea do what the sea always does. The waves came in. The waves went out. They did not rush. They did not hesitate. They moved with the unhurried certainty of something that has been doing this since the very beginning of the world and intends to keep doing it for a very long time. The sky was deepening, purple, then indigo, then the almost black that is not quite black because it is full of stars. The air smelled of salt and seaweed and the faint mineral scent of wet stone. I could hear the town behind me, the evening sounds I had come to love, doors closing gently, voices murmuring through open windows, a dog barking once, far away, and then falling silent, the clink of cups being washed, someone humming a tune I almost recognized. Let everything go now. Every thought that drifts through your mind, let it drift through and out again, like a wave that touches the shore and then retreats. You do not need to hold any of them. You do not need to solve any of them. They will be there in the morning if you need them. Tonight they can float. The sea kept its rhythm, in and out, in and out. My breathing matched it without my trying. My eyes grew heavy. The stars multiplied above me, filling the sky with their quiet, ancient light. I thought about the road from Jerusalem to Damascus. I thought about the road from Joppa to Caesarea. I thought about all the roads this story had already traveled, and all the roads still ahead. The long roads, the sea roads, the roads that would carry this small, stubborn, beautiful movement all the way to the edges of the known world. But that was tomorrow. That was next week. That was the distant future. Tonight there was only the sea, only the stars, only the sound of water on stone, over and over, patient and unceasing and kind. I closed my eyes. The waves continued, and the story went on. It always goes on. To Antioch, where the believers would be given a new name, to Cyprus, to the open sea, to cities I had never heard of and harbors I had never seen. There were journeys ahead, long, slow, beautiful journeys, and I would walk them with you, one step at a time, in no hurry at all. But for now, be still, be here, let the water sing you down. I traveled north. The road from the coast climbed gradually through green country, through valleys where rivers move slowly between groves of sycamore and laurel. Through towns I passed without stopping, their evening fires already lit, their voices soft behind mud brick walls. I was heading toward a city I had heard about many times but never visited, Antioch. It sat on the Orontes River, a broad and beautiful city, the third largest in the empire. Where Jerusalem was ancient and layered and heavy with memory, Antioch was wide and open and full of motion. The streets were paved and colonnaded. The market districts buzzed with a dozen languages at once. Greek merchants argued prices with Syrian farmers. Roman soldiers passed through on their way to somewhere else. The river moved through the center of it all like a slow green ribbon, unhurried, indifferent to the bustle on its banks. The believers who had scattered after Stephen's death, had made their way here, among other places. At first, they had spoken only to other Jewish residents, keeping the story within familiar boundaries, the way you keep a candle cupped in your hands when the wind is strong. But then some of them, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, travelers themselves, people who were used to crossing boundaries, began to speak to everyone. Greek speakers, non-Jewish residents, people who had never set foot in a synagogue or heard the old Psalms or observed a single Sabbath. And something remarkable happened. Those people listened and believed and joined in great numbers. The community in Antioch grew rapidly, not just in size, but in variety. It became the most diverse gathering of believers anywhere in the world. Fishermen from Galilee sat beside Greek philosophers. Syrian merchants broke bread with Jewish widows. Roman freedmen sang beside Ethiopian travelers. Let your body be heavy now. Let the full weight of you rest against the bed. Imagine you are sinking slowly into warm sand on a quiet shore. There is no need to hold yourself up. The earth will hold you. The church in Jerusalem heard about what was happening in Antioch, and they sent Barnabas to see for himself. Barnabas, his name meant son of encouragement, which was perfect, because that is exactly what he was. A large, warm man with a generous face, and the kind of laugh that made other people laugh even when they did not know what was funny. He arrived in Antioch and saw what was growing there, and was glad, deeply, simply glad. He stayed, and then he went to Tarsus to find Saul. Saul had been in Tarsus for some time, years in fact, with him, living quietly, waiting, perhaps wondering if the great reversal on the Damascus road had led to anything at all, or if he had simply been set aside. When Barnabas found him and asked him to come to Antioch, I imagine the relief was enormous. Not because Saul craved attention, but because he craved purpose. He had been given new eyes on that road, and he needed somewhere to look. Together, Barnabas and Saul taught in Antioch for an entire year. I was there for parts of it. The teaching happened in homes, mostly large open rooms where people reclined on cushions, and the evening breeze came through the windows, and the conversation went late into the night. There was food. There was always food. The Antioch believers were generous in a casual, almost careless way, as if sharing were simply the air they breathed. It was in Antioch that the believers were first called Christians. I do not know who said it first. It may have been an outsider, an observer, someone trying to put a name on this strange new movement that did not fit any existing category. But the name stuck, Christians, belonging to the Christ. It was not a name they chose for themselves, but they accepted it the way you accept a gift you did not expect, with surprise, and then with gratitude, and then with the quiet understanding that it had always been true. I liked Antioch. I liked the way the river looked at sunset, all gold and slow. I liked the sound of multiple languages winding through the evening air like different instruments in the same piece of music. I liked the feeling that something was beginning, not something small and cautious, but something that intended to reach a very long way. One day, during a time of prayer and fasting, the community in Antioch felt a clear and unmistakable prompting. Set apart Barnabas and Saul. Send them out. There is work for them to do beyond these walls, beyond this city, beyond the borders of anything familiar. And so the church did what churches do when they are brave and trusting and willing to let go of the people they love. They gathered around Barnabas and Saul. They placed their hands on their shoulders. They prayed, and then they released them, the way you release a bird from your cupped hands, not because you do not want it anymore, but because it was never yours to keep. They went to the harbor at Seleucia, the port city near Antioch, and boarded a ship for Cyprus. I stood on the dock and watched the vessel pull away from shore. The sails caught the wind with a sound like a long, slow exhale. The water was very blue. The sky was very clear, and the ship grew smaller and smaller until it was just a white mark on the horizon. And then not even that. I did not follow them on every journey. I could not. They moved too quickly, covered too much ground, touched too many places. But I heard the stories. Everyone heard the stories. They came back to Antioch like letters from a distant friend. Tales of island governors who listened and believed, of synagogues where the old word suddenly sounded new, of dusty inland cities where no one had heard the name before and now could not stop saying it. They sailed to Cyprus first, then crossed to the mainland, to the southern coast of what we now call Turkey, though it had many names then. They walked inland, through mountain passes where the air was thin and cold, and the road was barely a path. They came to Pisidian Antioch, a different Antioch, a Roman colony in the highlands, where Saul, now going by his Roman name, Paul, stood in the synagogue on the Sabbath and told the whole story from the beginning. Some believed, some did not. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. They would arrive in a new city, speak in the synagogue or the marketplace or someone's living room, and the room would divide. Not violently, but clearly. Like water parting around a stone. Some would lean in, others would lean away, and Paul and Barnabas would stay with those who leaned in for as long as they could, and then they would move on. They went to Iconium, to Lystra, to Derbe, small cities, Roman outposts, places where the Greek language sat uneasily on top of older local tongues. In each place they planted something, a small community, a handful of believers, a seed that would grow slowly in the soil long after they had gone. Let your jaw relax again. Let your mouth fall slightly open if it wants to. There is a softness in the face when the jaw releases. Let that softness spread to your cheeks, your forehead, the small muscles around your eyes. Let your whole face be at rest. The journey was not easy. There were moments of difficulty that I will frame gently, because this is a place of rest. In Lystra, Paul was hurt badly by a crowd that turned against him. But the believers gathered around him, stood over him in a circle like a living wall, and he got up. He got up and walked to the next city the very next day. Not because he was unaffected, but because the thing inside him was stronger than the thing outside him. They retraced their steps. They went back through each city they had visited, strengthening the small communities, appointing leaders, reminding the new believers that the road would not always be smooth, but that it would always be held. And then they sailed home to Antioch, and the church gathered around them, and Barnabas and Paul told the whole story, every city, every face, every moment, and the room was full of wonder. The door that had cracked open in Cornelius's living room had swung wide. The story was spreading to people in places that no one in that upper room in Jerusalem could have imagined. Sometime later, on a different journey, Paul traveled even further, across the sea to Macedonia, to Europe, to a Roman colony called Philippi, a city set in a wide green valley surrounded by hills. I arrived there a few days after Paul did. The air in Philippi was different from anywhere I had been, cooler, damper, scented with pine and wet earth. The city itself was orderly and Roman, all straight streets and stone arches, but the countryside around it was wild and green and full of birdsong. There was no synagogue in Philippi. The Jewish community was too small to have one, but Paul had heard that a group of women gathered on the Sabbath by the river, just outside the city gate, to pray. And so, on the Sabbath morning, he went to find them. I followed the path down to the river. It was a gentle walk. The path wound through a grove of plane trees whose broad leaves filtered the sunlight into soft, shifting patterns on the ground. I could hear the water before I could see it, a low, steady murmur, the sound of a river that is not in a hurry. The women were gathered on the bank, perhaps 8 or 10 of them, sitting on the grass near the water's edge, their voices quiet, their faces turned toward the morning light. It was an informal gathering, no walls, no roof, just the open sky and the river and the trees, and the sound of prayer rising gently into the air like steam from warm bread. Among them was a woman named Lydia. She was from Thyatira, a city far to the east, and she dealt in purple cloth, a luxury trade, expensive fabric dyed with a color so rich it looked almost alive. She was a businesswoman, independent, successful, the kind of person who knew her own mind and made her own decisions. Paul sat down with the group. I sat a little way off, near a willow tree whose branches trailed in the current. The grass was cool and slightly damp. A dragonfly hovered over the water, its wings catching the light in tiny iridescent flashes. Paul began to speak, quietly, conversationally, not preaching at them but talking with them, the way you talk with people you have just met by a river on a beautiful morning. He told them the story, the teacher, the promises, the wind, the open door. He told it the way you tell something you love, not trying to convince, just trying to share, the way you might share a view from a hilltop by simply pointing and saying, "Look." Lydia listened. And here is what the old account says about that moment, and I find it one of the most beautiful phrases in the entire story. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, opened her heart, not forced, not argued into submission, not overwhelmed by evidence, opened gently, the way a flower opens, the way a door opens when someone on the other side has been knocking very softly for a very long time, and you finally hear it and turn the handle. Let your breathing settle even deeper now, each exhale a little longer than the last, not by effort, by release, just letting the breath pour out of you like water from a tilted cup, slowly, gently, all the way to the bottom. Lydia was baptized that morning right there in the river. She walked in wearing her fine clothes, the clothes of a successful merchant, a woman of means, and the water rose around her, cool and clear, and she went under and came up again, and the morning light was on her face, and the water was running from her hair, and she was laughing. She was laughing the way the Ethiopian man on the desert road had rejoiced, not because everything was suddenly simple, but because something that had been closed was now open, and the air rushing in was sweet. Her whole household was baptized with her. And then she turned to Paul and said something I have always loved for its directness. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house." It was not a question. It was barely an invitation. It was a statement, a declaration. She had made her decision by the river, and now she was acting on it with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything else. You need a place to stay. I have a place. Come. Paul and his companions stayed at Lydia's house. It became the first gathering place for believers in Philippi, the first church in Europe, born not in a grand hall or a temple court, but in the home of a businesswoman who sold purple cloth and whose heart had been gently opened by a river on a Saturday morning. I stayed by the water for a while after they had gone. The river kept moving. The dragonfly was gone. The plane trees shifted in a breeze I could barely feel. Everything was very still and very full, the way a room is full after music has stopped playing. The silence is not empty. It is the shape the music left behind. I dipped my hand in the river. The water was cold and clean. It moved between my fingers and continued on its way, carrying whatever it carried: leaves, light. The memory of a woman walking in and coming up changed, downstream, toward the sea, toward everywhere. The journeys continued. Paul traveled relentlessly. Thessalonica, Athens, Corinth, Ephesus. Each city a new chapter, each community a new planting. He wrote letters to the churches he left behind, long and tender and sometimes exasperated letters, the way a parent writes to a child who has moved far away and is making both wonderful and questionable decisions. I could not keep up. No one could keep up with Paul. But I heard the stories, and I followed when I could, always a few steps behind, always arriving just after the most dramatic moment had passed, which suited me fine. I preferred the quiet aftermath, the part of the story where the dust is settled and someone is sweeping the floor and making tea and the ordinary business of being alive has resumed. The story of Acts does not end with a grand finale. It does not end with trumpets or fireworks or a dramatic last stand. It ends with Paul in Rome, the center of the world, the city all roads led to, living in a rented room, under house arrest, receiving visitors, teaching anyone who came to see him. I picture that room sometimes, a simple space, a window, a table, perhaps a lamp. Paul, older now, weathered by years of roads and seas and prisons and shipwrecks, sitting in a chair and telling the story once more to whoever walked through the door. A soldier, a merchant, a curious neighbor, a runaway slave, anyone, everyone. The door was open. That is how the book of Acts ends, not with a closing, with an opening. The door was open and Paul was speaking and the story was still being told. And the last line of the account says he did this with all boldness and without hindrance, even in a rented room, even under guard, even at the edge of his own strength. The story could not be locked in. It moved through walls and past borders and across seas and into the hearts of people whose names we will never know. And it kept going, and it kept going. And it is going still. I think about that open door. I think about it on nights like this, when the world is quiet and the day is done, and everything is settling into the long, soft pause between one chapter and the next. The door is open, the lamp is lit, and the story continues. Not because it has to, but because love is like that. It does not stop. It does not reach a border and turn back. It keeps going, into rooms you have never seen, along roads you have never walked, toward people you have never met, endlessly, patiently, gently, outward. And so, here we are, at the end of the road. Or not the end. There are no ends in a story like this, but a resting place. A place where the path widens into a clearing, and there is soft grass, and the sound of water somewhere nearby, and the sky is the deepest blue you have ever seen. You have walked a long way with me tonight, from Jerusalem to Damascus, from Joppa to Caesarea, from Antioch to Philippi, from an upper room to a rented room, and every road in between. I hope the walking was gentle. I hope the company was good. Let everything go now, every story, every name, every road and river and rooftop. Let them drift away from you like clouds moving slowly across a wide, wide sky. You do not need to hold any of it. It will all be here tomorrow, waiting for you, unchanged and patient. Your body is heavy and warm and held. The bed beneath you is soft. The room around you is safe. The night is doing what the night has always done. wrapping the world in quiet, giving everything permission to stop, to rest, to be still. Take one more slow breath, feel it fill you gently, and then let it go, all the way out until you are empty and light and quiet. The believers in the upper room waited, and the wind came. The Ethiopian man read alone on a desert road, and a companion appeared. Tabitha sewed her tunics in the afternoon light. Lydia walked into the river on a Saturday morning. Ananias knocked on the door of the man he feared most and called him brother. Small, brave, ordinary things, done by small, brave, ordinary people, in small, brave, ordinary rooms. You are in such a room right now, and you are held by the night, by the quiet, by something older and gentler and wider than any story I could tell. Sleep now. Sleep the way the sea moves, slowly, steadily, without effort. Let the waves carry you. You do not need to swim. You do not need to steer. Just float. Just rest. Just let go. The lamp is dimming. The stars are out. The road will be there in the morning, and it will be good, and there will be bread for the journey and company along the way. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, there is only this quiet, this warmth, this rest. Good night. You are held. You are seen. You are well.